This is the Unique Scotland podcast with exclusive ScottishVisits.co.uk.
Hello, this is John Harbour, and welcome to Unique Scotland, the podcast that gives you an overview of the whole of Scotland, its places, its people, and its history, as we travel the narrow roads and uneven tracks together all over this amazing country. This podcast is the final episode, part 6 of our epic journey around the North Coast 500. This tour, so far in the previous 5 episodes, has taken us from Inverness up the east coast of Scotland, along the spectacular north coast and down via Ullapool to the Corrishalloch Gorge. What you have in store now as we continue our journey to our final destination at Inverness via the west coast of Scotland is some amazing clifftop views, fabulous sandy beaches and incredible glacial valley transits. The whole trip has been an extraordinary journey of over 500 miles, and it's been lovely to have some of you with me so far on this extraordinary adventure. It's been a while since the last transmission of episode 5, but as I'm sure you're probably well aware, life does occasionally get in the way of work and pastimes. For me, it's been selling up my house on the west coast of Scotland and relocating to the east coast, and buying a new house, which I'm pleased to say is closer to family and grandkids. It's amazing the number of stories I hear of people with grandkids relocating to be nearer their loved ones. Anyway, I feel as if I've settled into my new abode and a wonderful part of the country. And I'm now ready to resume my podcasting, which I have to say I have missed very much. And to Nick Singh, who I mentioned at the end of my last podcast, I'm back. And while I'm mentioning people, I'd like to say hi to Nathan Sholkovich, who I gave a shout out to in part 1. And it's great to see that you are following the whole series. The amazing thing about podcasting is that the episodes that have already been launched remain out there in the ether, and these complimentary episodes will remain available for your enjoyment. And I'm delighted to say that many of you have emailed to say how much you've enjoyed them. Indeed, I've met a few of my listeners on holiday in Scotland on the back of them listening to the particular podcast. And a good example of that is Caroline Tucci and her family, who I mentioned in my last podcast. That was the New Year message. And they came over from the States for a holiday, and we were able to meet for lunch and a wee tour of Edinburgh Castle. I was able to record them enjoying their time in Scotland just before they set off on their own epic tour of the Highlands. And you can hear their recording on my previous podcast. Well, as I record this podcast, I am in my study in my lovely new house in the village of Aberlady. It's about 20 minutes east of Edinburgh, on the coast, which means it's a lovely coastal walk for me to enjoy. It's rained a lot over the last month, but suddenly about a week ago it became really cold and we have had our first snow. Temperatures are down to around 2 degrees Celsius or around 36 Fahrenheit, but as it often happens on the East Coast, the sky is blue with radiant sunshine streaming into my study. Anyway, my heating's turned up and I'm quite comfortable with my cup of tea, a chocolate biscuit and wee Minnie, my little spaniel dog, lying at my feet. Minnie is a great moral support as I launch into the final part of the North Coast 500 series. She never says much, but she does bark if someone comes to the door, so she may feature if I'm recording when the postman arrives. Okay, well, turning now to this podcast, you may recall in episode 5 that we'd reached the Corrishalloch Gorge, a deep natural glacial ravine and one of the most spectacular gorges in Scotland. From the Corrishalloch Gorge on the A835, we turned right onto the A832 and then drove on to the village of Dundonnell, where we bunked down for the night at the Birches B&B. This final leg of the journey, part 6, will take us from Dundonnell along another fabulously scenic route through Poolewe, Gairloch, Sheildaig, Applecross, Achnasheen and Beauly, to mention but a few. Well, I think it's time to get on the road, and as always, it's great to share Scotland with you. Perhaps this podcast will whet your appetite to come and visit this fine country for yourselves. Or, if for whatever reason you can't come in person, then let me bring Scotland to you. To see some great photos of the trip and my videos of Scotland, please visit my website, exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk. And do go to the podcast page to email subscribe. It just means that you'll get notification of future episodes, and this information is never shared with anyone. Well, wherever you are in the world, I would now like you to relax, sit back and be transported to Scotland on the sixth and final part of our unique Scotland journey around the North Coast 500. At the end of my last podcast, we had stayed overnight at the Birches B&B, and I recall sitting on the wooden deck overlooking Loch Broom and looking forward to the final leg of our journey together. Well, we now leave our oasis of calm behind, and at the end of the drive, we cross a cattle grid to get back onto the main road, and that's the A832. Before turning right to start our journey, I just looked behind to see the sun glistening on Loch Broom, and in front of us, the shadow of the mountain and Bealach is towering above us. It's not long before we arrive at the small settlement of Ardessie, with a few houses either side of the road. Now, if you go on a mile or so outside the village, you will come to the Ardessie parking place on the left-hand side, and there's a Scottish water building on top of a rise, and to the left of the car park is a rough and at times steep path leading up the side of a hill. Now, this will take you up to Ardessie waterfalls, and who doesn't like cascading, crashing water down a mountainside? Well, there's several small falls before you get to the main one, but an added reward for climbing to the height are the superb views down Little Loch Broom. What more can you ask for? When we get back onto the road, about 2 miles further on is the small settlement of Badcoll, a real blink and you miss it sort of place, but for those adventurous souls driving a mobile home or a camper van around these roads, there's a small parking area on the right-hand side called the Northern Lights Caravan Park that looks very enticing for an overnight stop, right next to and overlooking Little Loch Broom. Like its sister loch, Little Loch Broom is a sea loch and connects to the Atlantic. It is possible to fish on the loch from the shore or by boat, and you have to obtain a fishing permit from a local post office. The normal catch is brown trout or sea trout, not dissimilar to salmon. The loch is a conservation area, and it's always fascinating to watch numerous cormorants with wings outstretched sunning themselves on the pinnacles of rock that stick out of the loch. We continue on and come to the small settlement of Mungsdale, and as we do, we're starting to head south again, and the sight that greets us on the right-hand side of the car is a fabulous beach that the west coast is so famous for. And if we look in the distance, we can also see the outline of the outer Hebridean island of Lewis. We drive on and come to Grenard Bay, and the sands and blue sea are so inviting that we just have to pull over to the side of the road and take a stroll along the deserted beach. This is not uncommon in this part of the world, and it feels like you're on a deserted island as you kick up the sand and look across the bay over the clear blue water to the Atlantic beyond. I probably should mention that this whole area was once part of Mackenzie lands, so if you belong to the Mackenzie clan, then you must come and see what you're missing. Well, as we reach the Grenard River, which runs into Grenard Bay, we find ourselves at Grenard House and Estate that used to belong to a successful Victorian industrialist in the 1890s. He developed the house to its present size, which was used as a sporting and hunting lodge. I mentioned the Outer Hebrides, that's the islands that can be seen from the beach of Grenard Bay, and they're a great asset to the house because they actually protect this whole area from the North Atlantic gales by acting as a barrier during the more destructive storms. And the great advantage to this west coast of Scotland is that the Gulf Stream flows by and gives it a warmer climate from the east coast and allows for more tropical types of plants to be grown. Now, I'm not suggesting you can get your bikini out and sunbathe on a regular basis, but the temperature difference between the east and west is marginal, but it's just enough on this west coast to give more tropical plants the ability to survive. Grinard Garden evolved from a kitchen garden and is hidden from immediate view, so it's a glorious surprise when you see it for the first time. It's in a wonderful setting with the mountains towering over the bay, with a view of the bay and Atlantic to die for, and the sound of the river Grinard running past with a roar when in spate and a murmuring when running at a gentler pace. The garden is quite small, but the quality is outstanding. It's rectangular with 3 pathways. There's an orchard with pergolas with apples and climbing roses giving height and structure to the garden. There are an enormous variety of shrubs and perennials, and fruit and vegetables also thrive in this space, so you can see what a delight this house and garden are in the midst of the beauty of the Highlands. So, another must-see when on a tour of the northwest of Scotland, Grinard House and Gardens. And we get a fond farewell from the gardener as we depart for Gairloch Bay and another fabulous sandy beach. When we leave Grinard House and Gardens on the narrow single-track road, we come back onto the A832 and turn left heading southwest towards Gairloch. The road is dual track but still narrow and is hemmed in by forestry on the left and a line of trees on the right with some sheep farming land beyond. It's not long until the road bends round towards the coast once more and Grinard Bay comes into view. There's a large parking area on our left-hand side and access to the beach is across the road, through a small wooden turnstile and down some wooden steps. It's nice to take a stroll along this relatively narrow white sandy beach, and it's not long before I arrive at the water's edge. It's on arrival here that I look out onto Grinard Bay, and I'm reminded of the not-so-good news that I mentioned in my previous podcast. What I can see from this spot is an island called Grinard Island. Sadly, it also has the moniker of Anthrax Island, and it's quite a story to tell in such a beautiful part of the world. The island is approximately 1¼ miles long by ½ mile wide, and is about ½ mile offshore. The island is actually mentioned by a Dean Munro who travelled to the area in the mid-16th century. He wrote that it's Clan Mackenzie territory. It was full of woods, and it was good for fostering of thieves and rebels, meaning that it was a great hiding place for thieves and rebels. Today the place is treeless and has been uninhabited since 1920, although there were 6 people living here in 1881. The island became famous, or infamous, after the Second World War as a place not to visit after the Ministry of Defence closed it to the public. In 1942, biological warfare tests were being conducted at the Biology Department of Portendown, which is still used by the Ministry of Defence today. It is now called the Ministry of Defence's Science and Technology Laboratory and employs some of the country's top scientists who carry out research into the world's most dangerous pathogens. Indeed, Portendown became involved in identifying the poison that nearly killed the Skripals, the Russian spy and his daughter, in the Russian government chemical agent Novichok attack in Salisbury. Anyway, before I digress too much, when the British government during the Second World War wished to investigate the feasibility of producing biological weapons, they chose Grinard Island as the place to do the tests. They realised that the tests would cause long-lasting contamination of the immediate area by anthrax spores, so a remote uninhabited island was required, and that's where Grinard Island comes in. Under the rather absurd name of Operation Vegetarian, scientists and about 50 personnel organised 80 sheep to be taken to the island, and bombs filled with anthrax were exploded near to them. Well, the results were very positive for science, but not for the sheep, who all met their maker. After the tests, scientists concluded that a large release of anthrax spores would thoroughly pollute German cities, rendering them uninhabitable for decades. Now I have to balance this story with the fact that the Germans had already manufactured similar weapons that were being used in their own style of warfare. After the war, Grinard Island remained quarantined for nearly 48 years, and it wasn't until 1986 that a concerted effort was made to decontaminate the island. After a huge operation to remove all traces of the anthrax, the quarantine was lifted. On the 1st of May 1990, the island was repurchased by the heirs of the original owner for the original sale price of £500, and the island is now considered safe to visit. So, a not-so-good news event, but it does have a happy ending. I'm not sure the owners are going to open it up to the public anytime soon, however. Of course, I could have said nothing at all about this piece of World War II history, especially now that it's fixed, but this whole area is connected in some way with World War II, and I'm going to give you a little more as we work our way along the coast. Indeed, as we continue our way along the coast, we actually come to a number of small settlements, the first of which is called Second Coast. The second settlement is called First Coast, and before we pass through Sand and Lade. And when I say small settlements of the past, well, if you blink you miss them. Having said that, First Coast almost became famous for the discovery in 2014 by a university student, a hut circle, which in archaeological terms is a circular or oval depression in the ground with evidence of a low stone wall around it. Effectively, it's the foundations of Neolithic man's dwelling. It's about 4,000 years old, and the superstructure would have been made of timber and thatch. But as we continue on, the road bends round to the left towards Alt Bay. If you look at a map, you will see there's a road that goes straight on, and when I drive in this area, I usually take time to go straight ahead onto the peninsula with Greenstone Point at the end. If there's time, there are some lovely, out-of-the-way sandy beaches in this area, and I sometimes have a picnic at Melon Adrigal Beach, which is a charming outlook across the bay to the Summer Isles. Anyway, we are winding our way around to Alt Bay, and, as I've mentioned before, this area played an important part in the Second World War. And sure enough, just before we enter Alt Bay, on the right-hand side is a building housing the Russian Arctic Convoy Museum. It's fascinating, and I'd recommend a visit when you're in the area. A little more on why there's a Russian Arctic Convoy Museum shortly. We turn right off the single-track road, where the view opens up once more onto a fabulous bay called Loch Ewe, and there is the village of Alt Bay. Alt Bay has wonderful views out to Cove and the island of Lewis in the distance, as well as the nearby Torridon Mountains. It's a small fishing village situated on the shores of Loch Ewe. Population about 500, and when I entered I saw that there was a small primary school and 2 hotels. The last time I visited, I looked forward to a bite to eat, a nice coffee and a seat in the conservatory looking out onto the bay. Bliss. However, both hotels were closed, which took me aback somewhat considering the beauty of the area and how wonderful it would be to stay locally. Well, I did a bit of digging and discovered a wee scandal about the Alt Bay Hotel. It appears that in April 2019, when guests were staying at the hotel, one of the staff who was doing the breakfast shift received a phone call from the owner to say, in simple terms, he wasn't coming back, and the staff were to inform the clients staying at the hotel to find somewhere else to stay. It appears that the owner took off in the night, although he did have the decency to phone in the morning to give instructions to move the guests on and tell the staff to close the hotel. A former employee who was quoted in the local Free Press stated that he had come into work as normal for the breakfast shift, only to find that the owner David Shalom had left the hotel and it would be closing. Well, I looked at a post on the Visit Wester Ross Facebook page from the time, and it read, "Important notice. We understand that the Alt Bay Hotel appears to have suddenly closed without warning. A notice has appeared on the door to that effect. Their Facebook page has stopped and the owners have reportedly left the area." It's understood from local sources that the hotel is up for sale, but cannot be sold for legal reasons. I asked the local if she knew anything about the situation and how long had the hotel been closed.
It's been closed for, must be over a year now, probably. I think the banks kind of technically own it. The owner didn't run her.
Ah.
Yeah. So nobody really knows where he is, and nobody's been able to buy it because they need the owner to sign something, is my understanding.
So, a complete mystery, and even today we're not sure exactly what's going on, but watch the space. There may be a nice little hotel for about £500,000 going for sale in Alt Bay in the not too distant future. Sorry, I went off on a tangent there, but I just wanted to share some of the shenanigans in this podcast, as well as the beauty. And there is beauty aplenty, with fabulous sandy beaches, as well as rocky shores, and as you look across Loch Ewe, you will see an island called, believe it or not, the island or Isle of Ewe. I always have fun with couples when I'm standing looking out across the bay at the island. I'll ask the couple to stand side by side, show them the map with the name of the island, and ask them to say the name to each other. Of course, they think nothing of it and say, "I love you." And when I reply, "I love you too," they smile. Scattered around the area are the remains of World War II buildings and barracks. If you go to the local football pitch, there's a display board which describes the role of the buildings in detail, and it's not uncommon on beaches around the United Kingdom to find old concrete anti-tank defences, and in fields nearby the old bunkers that would have housed defending troops from the threat of invasion. But there are so many in the local area here, in Alt Bay, because Alt Bay was so important to the war effort. It's hard to imagine this beautiful loch in Wester Ross was used to such an extent in the Second World War, but it actually has a natural deep water harbour. That linked directly to the Atlantic Ocean via a relatively narrow mouth which made it easier to defend against the danger of enemy submarines. There was also heavy anti-aircraft batteries that were seldom troubled by enemy aircraft other than perhaps the odd reconnaissance plane. Well, in February 1941, the loch became an Atlantic and Russian convoy collecting point, and remained so throughout the war. And this is where the famous Arctic convoys, or PQ convoys as they were called, left from, to take vital supplies to Murmansk and Archangel in Russia, who were struggling themselves in a war against Germany. PQ was the code name for the convoys, and if you want to read a fascinating book about the extreme hardships and real-life drama at sea during World War II, then I do recommend the book PQ-17, which suffered the most losses to German aircraft, submarines and German battleships during that time. You can tell that I'm a retired naval officer. I do love a good maritime book, and I have to say a huge thank you to a previous guest who travelled through Scotland with me, Gary and Susan Sheeb, who know of my love of naval history, and sent me another excellent book on PQ-17 called The Ghost Ships of Archangel, and that was written by William Giroux, which talks specifically about the PQ-17 and brings to light the heroics of that convoy. The last convoy sailed from Loch Ewe on 30th of December 1944. Altogether 481 merchant ships and over 100 naval escort vessels left Loch Ewe for Russia in a total of 19 convoys. Many never made it back. Today Loch Ewe still has a naval presence with a NATO fuel station nearby, and you can see the huge fuel tanks on the hill above a long jetty jutting out into the sea for NATO warships to arrive and refuel. There are still a lot of old buildings overlooking Loch Ewe, and a memorial with the inscription on one says the following: "In memory of our shipmates who sailed from Loch Ewe during World War II. They lost their lives in the bitter Arctic sea battles to North Russia and never returned to this tranquil anchorage. We will always remember them." So if you are ever visiting this area and enjoying the incredible beauty of the mountains, beaches and clear blue sea, just pause a while and give a thought to the part that Alt Bay played in protecting our democratic freedoms. Well, as we leave Alt Bay and head south towards Gairloch, there is one place to stop and allow nature to take away all your cares, and that is Inverness Garden near Poolewe. I've talked previously about the Gulf Stream, which comes up the west coast of the United Kingdom, and the warming effect it has on the waters of the west coast of Scotland. Well, Inverness, which is well sheltered at the southern end of Loch Ewe, takes advantage of the Gulf Stream. As you will recall from previous podcasts, the word Inver means at the mouth of, and in this case it's at the mouth of the River Ewe, which, as it happens, is one of the shortest rivers in Scotland. Inverness is a botanical garden and is noted for the breadth of its collection. The land on which it was created was a barren wilderness on the Atlantic coast in the Northwest Highlands, and in 1862 a gentleman named Osgood Mackenzie took his 2,200-acre estate and turned it into an amazing garden against the challenges of a windy west coast and poor soil. To solve this, he planted a mixture of large trees to act as a windbreak, such as Corsican pine, Douglas fir and rhododendrons. He then set about planting as many exotic plants as possible until his death in 1922. The garden covers some 50 acres and today has some 2,500 exotic plants and flowers. The garden seems to have been created from experimentation, and the colour, scents have been cultivated with care and a hefty dose of creativity. You may even enjoy a glimpse of some of the wildlife in the garden, and there's red squirrel, red deer, seals on the shore, and you might even see a seagull fishing on the loch. There's also a lovely walled garden filled with exotic plants that come into their own in the summer. Even in the winter, Inverness is colourful, as the bark of many rhododendra are beautifully and delicately coloured, and the collection of native and non-native trees, including Poolewe trees, add to the variety. And a real treat are the huge Californian redwoods that tower above the gardens. After Osgood's death, his family kept the garden going until 1952. His daughter, Mary Sawyer, handed the garden over to the National Trust for Scotland, who still manage it today. The garden continues to be developed by the small team of 10 gardeners, and it's lovely to wander around the garden with Loch on one side and a beautifully terraced garden on the other. It's amazing what can be grown in one of the most northerly corners of Scotland when you put your mind to it. It's a real treat to meander through a garden in this remote stretch of coastline and enjoy a wonderful array of both local and unusual exotic plants. And you do get the feeling that this was built out of love and an enduring commitment, and it's a must visit if you're in the area. While continuing southwest on our journey, we quickly arrive at the small village of Poolewe, which is situated at the sheltered south side of Loch. With a population of about 300, it's a neat and very attractive village, with a stunning location and one of the reasons that it gets so many visitors in the summer. It comprises a main street of largely white painted buildings, and it's also home to a beautiful Episcopalian church, St Melruvas. It stands a little back from the main road, and is a low single-storey building whose walls are supported by massive buttresses. It gives the impression of a medieval or a Celtic church which has survived over the centuries. After all, St Melruva was an Irish monk who founded a monastery further south at Applecross in the 7th century. Well, an old building it may be, but the church itself was only opened in 1965. The most obvious clue that it's not an ancient church is that its alignment is roughly north-south, whereas early church builders would have generally built an east-west alignment, and you can see that today in most church buildings and cathedrals. As it happens, the people of Poolewe used to worship in the village hall or the Gairloch Hotel, but in the early 1960s, Major and Mrs Buchanan MacDonald gifted an existing old byre to the community, and work began on a rebuild to a design inspired by early Celtic churches. Well, leaving Poolewe behind, we continue for another 5 miles and finally reach Gairloch and are presented with a superb view of Loch Gairloch and a huge expanse of golden sands. In the centre of the village of Gairloch, I found the Gale Centre, where I met a young lady called Louise, who told me a little bit about Gairloch.
Gairloch's got a few pubs and cafes, and we've got the Gairloch Museum, which won Museum of the Year recently.
Wow.
Which is really cool, and that's just next door to us. Obviously, the Gale Centre, where I am just now, is got a community shop and a community cafe. Again, there's lots of nice beaches, lots of good walks. There's like a harbour as well, so there's boat trips that run from there.
Yeah, I've actually been to Gairloch Beach. It's absolutely lovely.
Yeah, it's a lovely beach. Really nice.
And that was Louise telling us just a little bit about what Gairloch has to offer. And when I visited last, I stopped at the grocery store for a lunchtime sandwich, and even here the effect of COVID, sadly, was being felt as I stood in a queue of 3 people outside the shop, as only 4 people were being allowed into the narrow-aisled grocery store at the time. However, in the Highlands you will come across Highland hospitality, and Gairloch's store was no exception. A young lady in the store came outside to help and took my order, went back inside. When the queue reduced and I found myself at the front, my goods were ready for me just to pay. Lovely touch and very efficient. Well, now it was time to go down onto the beach and enjoy the sandwich. I walked away from the village and descended onto the beach from the quiet road not far from the Gairloch Hotel. It was sublime. At the top of the beach were pebbles, and I put down my jacket for somewhere to sit. Just beyond me was a patch of broken shells, a shingly mark on the shore indicating the high tide mark, but beyond, stretching for what seemed like miles, was a beautiful sandy beach leading down to the blue water of Loch Gairloch and the open sea beyond. Now, I can think of nothing better than enjoying fresh sandwiches, some smoked ham and cheese, by the way, a cool drink and some chocolate snacks on a fabulous beach looking out to sea, with the outline of the Trotternish Ridge on the Isle of Skye in the distance. The amazing thing is that I had this entire stretch of fabulous beach to myself. Actually, a young couple came onto the beach later with a dog, and it was fascinating to watch it having the time of its life, dashing in and out of the water to retrieve the ball that was being thrown by its owners. But that was it. Miles of beach, and it was all mine. After an hour of sheer bliss, we must leave this tranquility and get back onto the NC500 and continue our journey south on the A832. As we head south, the road is dual track, but still narrow. Either side is a shallow bank of silver birch trees with ferns, gorse and wild rhododendra at the side of the road. Ahead we are starting to see the Torridon Mountains, and Bel Alligan at over 3,000 feet is just visible. After 6 or 7 miles of driving, we start to see, through the short fir trees on the left, the wonderful Loch Marie. The loch's 13.5 miles long with a maximum width of about 2.5 miles and is the 4th largest freshwater loch in Scotland. Its outflow to the sea, actually, is the River Ewe that I mentioned earlier, and the loch itself contains 5 large wooded islands and over 60 smaller ones. The largest island, Eilean Savain, contains a loch that itself contains an island, a situation that occurs nowhere else in Great Britain. This island of Marie holds the remains of an 8th century chapel believed to be the hermitage of St Melruva, who I mentioned before, and who founded the monastery of Applecross in the 7th century. The loch actually gets its name from the saint. Now, the islands of Loch Marie are the location of some of the best native Caledonia pinewood in Scotland, an original species that has been considerably depleted, and the islands are now protected by conservation designations. The most prominent mountain on the northern side of Loch Marie is Sleoch, one of Scotland's Munros, which dominates the eastern end of the loch above Kinloch Ewe. Queen Victoria visited the area in 1877 when the royal party travelled from Balmoral back to London. She arrived by train and stayed at the Loch Marie Hotel for 6 nights, which still bears the royal crest above the door, and it's worth stopping just to have a look at it. Not far from the hotel is a waterfall with a viewing platform which is named Victoria Falls, and that was after the Queen visited this site. Due to its remote location, there is now little industry surrounding Loch Marie. However, in the 17th century it would have been throbbing, as it was an area for ironworking. Hundreds of hectares of oak woodland was turned into charcoal to fuel the smelting of bog iron. There was no iron ore in the vicinity, but it was clearly more cost effective to bring the iron ore to a site of fuel rather than the other way around. And back to the 21st century, sea trout and salmon can be found in the loch and provide food for the other wildlife, such as the black-throated diver and otter. There are some wonderful viewing points along the loch, and it's very relaxing to spend some time in reflection in this quiet spot before continuing on. About 10 miles later, we come to the small village of Kinloch Ewe. The village itself has a few shops, a post office, a hotel, and some mountain chalets. There are some B&Bs in the area and also a couple of churches. And the point to note here that it is a petrol station or gas station, one of the very few stations for miles around, so if you're getting low on fuel, top up before you leave. There's an interesting First World War memorial in the village. It's a tall stone column and commemorates those locals who gave their lives in the Great War. I noticed that there are also some Canadian and New Zealand soldiers mentioned, and there were also 2 sergeants from the Seaforth Highlanders, and that's a local Scottish regiment. They were both awarded the DCM, or the Distinguished Conduct Medal, and although both got home safely, sadly both subsequently died of their wounds. Now, if we were going straight back to Inverness, we would continue on towards Achnasheen, but as we're following the North Coast 500, we will turn right here onto the A836 and out onto the Applecross Peninsula. As you'll see on your maps, the peninsula extends all the way out into the inner sound, effectively into the Atlantic, and we're going to get onto a very narrow road to hug the coastline all the way around, but it is stunningly beautiful. Having turned right and now back into single-track road territory, it can be a pretty rough road at times. We're now in Wester Ross and the southeast corner of the Ben Egg National Nature Reserve, which is named after the local mountain, Ben Egg, and which we will see on our right-hand side as we travel down Glen Torridon. As we drive down, we'll see some surviving areas of natural forest, as this area would have been covered in forest back in the 17th century. However, as I mentioned before, this was all cut down to fuel the iron smelting that was prevalent in this area. Wheesht, Minnie. Okay, that's the postman just arriving, so I'll stop momentarily and return shortly. Thank you. Okay, package recovered. Minnie's back in her bed. And once again, peace and quiet has returned as I come back to our turning just to the right, and we're now heading down Glen Torridon. Well, at the start of the drive, it's barren heather shrubland, and you will eventually come to Loch Clare on the left-hand side. To our right, of course, is Ben Egg, towering above us, and ahead of us, just off to the right, is the mountain Leotach. The single-track road widens in some places, but don't be fooled. Prepare to pull over if a car's coming towards you. It is narrow and bumpy if the road has not been repaired. Right and left is nothing but heather and rock scrubland, leading to the slopes of the towering mountains. About halfway down the road towards Torridon, you will find on the right-hand side a car park, which is the parking place used for walkers who wish to climb Ben Egg. There's a space for about 20 cars, and at most times of the year you'll be able to find a parking place if you wish to ascend the spectacular mountain, and it is really quite breathtaking. In terms of distance from the turning that we took, it's about 8 miles down to Torridon. Of course, there is the state of the road to take into account, and the fact that the single-track road will undoubtedly slow you down. However, it's a lovely drive with clumps of pine trees and some old Scots pine that you'll see on your way, and of course the river Torridon running down beside you on the left-hand side. It's really quite lovely. I have to say it's one of my favourite valleys to drive down. The wilderness, the scrubland, the river running alongside you, and the mountains towering above, and little else until you get to the small village of Torridon, which is where we now arrive. As it happens, Torridon village is about half a mile on a small track to the right of the main road that we are travelling on. Is only a small group of houses with a caravan park in the locality. We don't actually go into Torridon, and as such we continue on this road, and you will see a sign for Annat, that's Annat, A-N-N-A-T. Once again, a small settlement on the shore of Upper Loch Torridon. If you're interested in old graveyards, then just as you come into Annat on the left-hand side is an ancient graveyard with some stones dating back to the medieval period. In the 19th century, a new graveyard was added to the east, but I have to say the old graveyard has some interesting grave markers and well worth a look. Annat itself is just a small settlement, and as you drive along the road on the left-hand and the right-hand side, you'll find small white cottages. When you leave the settlement about 1 mile further down on the right-hand side, you'll see a magnificent red sandstone Victorian mansion house with turrets. This is Ben Damf House, and it was completed in 1887 by William King Noel, the first Earl of Lovelace. He built it as a hunting lodge. Now, William was an English landowner, Lord Lieutenant of Surrey, and a distinguished scientist. He married Lord Byron's only legitimate daughter, Ada, who was a pioneering poetical scientist who assisted Charles Babbage in understanding and writing the first computer program. Fascinating connections to these wonderful old houses. Well, today the house is the famous 5-star Torridon Hotel. It was completed in the 50th year of Queen Victoria's reign, and there are many features within the house reflecting this period. For example, the drawing room has an unusual zodiac ceiling, which is a tribute to Queen Victoria's fascination with astrology. We continue along the A896 towards the village of Sheildaig. Compared to the road through the Torridon Glen, this road is lined with trees, mainly tall, straight spruce pine. The areas either side are fenced off, and you may notice the fence on the right-hand side is much taller and relatively new, and this is to try to stop deer from jumping out of the forested area onto the road. As you can imagine, hitting a deer might just ruin your day. You'll also get glimpses of Upper Loch Torridon through the trees as you drive along this stretch of road. A couple of miles further on the right-hand side, you come to a large car park, and that's the Loch Torridon viewpoint, which allows you to stop and take in the beauty of Loch Torridon. There's an information board here which helps you understand the local area and the beauty of the scene before you. And if you turn around and look behind you, facing away from the sea, is the mountain called Ben Damf, just under 3,000 feet. And as you continue along this route, the views are breathtaking, with the sea to your right and in the distance the towering slopes of mountains such as Ben Alligan, Ben Breck and Ben Derg. A couple of miles further on and the road starts to descend and you come to the sign for the village of Sheildaig. Now just after you've passed the sign, look on the right hand side for the signpost to the village, as it's easy to miss, and if you drive straight on you'll bypass this lovely little watering hole. It's a small single track, very steep road that takes you down to this little hamlet, and as you drop down you'll start to get a feeling of this picturesque, calm and welcoming village. On the left hand side there's a long row of lovely white cottages facing the sea, and on the right hand side you're right next to the water's edge of Sheildaig Bay. As it happens, the village is not that old, as it was founded only in 1800, with a view to training up British sailors for the war against Napoleon. After the Napoleonic Wars, the community founded a new role as a fishing village. Although fishing is no longer the mainstay of the economy, some shellfish is still landed. Also, many people still come to the area to fish and to walk in the surrounding mountains. The name Sheildaig comes from the Old Norse, meaning herring bay, which is most appropriate, noting that a great deal of money was made during the herring boom of the late 19th century. Today there's a community of around 85 people. It's got its own school, a small pub and a village hall. It's also got a church and 2 restaurants, and it's certainly used as a holiday destination in the summer, especially for those travelling on the North Coast 500. When I've passed through before, I'm often intrigued by a small island just off the coast which acts as a weather buffer protecting the bay from the prevailing western gales. Well, this island is covered by a large number of tall Scots pine trees, and I wondered why they survived when all the woodland around did not. My research has discovered that this island was never harvested to rig out the Royal Navy's wooden warships or men of war to fight in the Napoleonic Wars, and it's now become a nature sanctuary. It is also home to some white-tailed sea eagles, one of the largest birds in the British Isles, so keep an eye out and keep your binoculars handy. You might just be lucky enough to spot one of these majestic birds soaring high on the wing above the island. Well, before I depart, I might just pop into a local cafe and get a nice hot cup of tea with a homemade sandwich and a cake and take it down onto one of the benches right by the side of the loch and just enjoy the wonderful views across Loch Torridon. After you've enjoyed your small break, you get back on the road and continue driving in the same direction, and you soon reconnect with the A896. You turn right and continue your North Coast 500 adventure. About a mile after leaving the village, look out for a small brown sign on the left-hand side showing the way to Applecross. Very soon up ahead you will see a turning to the right with a signpost showing the route of the NC500, and that is the road you must take. It's called the Applecross Coast Road, and although it's particularly barren in places, it does have some wonderful views at the top of the peninsula leading down to Applecross. It's single track again, so beware, and this road is not as well kept as some other single track roads around Scotland, so watch out for potholes. However, it's a nice drive around the coast, and although initially the view is obscured by shrub and small trees, in particular silver birch, the vista eventually opens up to give you a good view over Loch Torridon and the Atlantic beyond. I thought I might mention areas to park when you wish to take photographs. The small laybys, or the small indentations with a signpost saying passing place, is just that. It's a passing place, and it's illegal to stop there for any length of time. So try to find an elongated parking space or an indented parking space where it's clear that parking is acceptable and you can wander away to take a few photographs of the surrounding area. I mean, if you're just stopping for a few moments and a photograph and there's no other cars around, then you can do so, but beware, it is illegal. Beyond Sheildaig, you're starting to get into cleared low scrubland again, and on the left-hand side you'll see a few lochs as you drive south. You will also see signposts at the side of the road showing the names of old settlements, but don't be surprised if there are no houses in the vicinity. Many of these settlements were cleared to make way for sheep, or the local people simply gave up the way of life to move on to pastures new. One such sign along the road is Arena, and apart from a few houses on the right-hand side, there's nothing else left of the settlement. The next settlement is Fernmoor, and this consists of a B&B and a few houses. A few miles beyond Fernmoor, and you have the Croft Store, which is a shop and weaving workshop, and it's well worth a stop on your route south. Continuing south on the coast road, you'll pass through the settlements of Calmakill and Lawnbane, but don't expect too many houses, as I've said before. We simply continue along this road and eventually come to the small village of Applecross. About 2 miles before you actually get to the village, there's a turning to the right down to a car park, and this serves to allow you to go down to the beautiful Applecross sands, where you'll find a lovely beach down on the right-hand side. A little bit further on, and you'll come to Applecross Bridge, which crosses the Applecross River. And I can remember the last time I came here, as I was crossing the bridge, I looked to the right and could see the Cuillin Mountains of the Isle of Skye in the distance. It was dusk with slightly low cloud, but the setting sun was just breaking through with iridescent beams of light over the mountains and across the sea. It was an absolutely glorious sight. So as you cross the bridge, and if the visibility is good, glance to your right. After the bridge, continue along for another couple of miles. It's single-track road and you're hugging the sea to the right-hand side, and eventually you'll come into the village of Applecross itself. In fact, the first building on the left-hand side you come to will be a small wooden building called the Coal Shed, and this is a craft and gift shop. You'll see on the right-hand side the sign pointing towards the village and showing some of the amenities available locally. I know that I've been talking about the village of Applecross. Well, in reality, Applecross refers to all the settlements around this most isolated peninsula, and these include Sand, Caldy, Camasterach and Toscaig, and it's also the name of the local estate. The village that we're just about to enter is actually called Shore Street, or as it's known locally, the Street. Population of the entire peninsula is around 550, and there's around 80 people living on the street. It's believed that the first occupation of the peninsula was by St Milruba, who was a 7th century monk who established a monastery in the area. Applecross used to be extremely isolated and was only accessible by boat until the early 20th century, and even then access was by one of the most treacherous roads in Scotland called Bealach na Ba, or Pass of the Cattle. And we'll have the pleasure of travelling on that road very shortly after we've left the street. Applecross is popular because of its isolation, and as you drive onto the street you'll find on the left-hand side an excellent watering hole called the Applecross Inn. Across the street from the inn is a seating out area, and in the summer you can take a beverage and have a splendid meal served to you as you look across Applecross Bay towards the islands of the Inner Hebrides. The street itself is just a row of houses, quaint cottages, and across the road from each cottage is a private garden on the shore, and many of the residents have built a small seating out area to enjoy the summer views themselves. It's a charming little settlement, and whether you want an alcoholic beverage or some refreshment, or even just an ice cream, it's well worth taking time out in this part of the world to enjoy the views and reflect on your journey so far. Well, after you've enjoyed the delights of Applecross Street, you have to retrace your steps and go back to the junction that you passed on your way in. When you reach the coal shed once more, you turn right here with the signposts showing Loch Carron 10 miles and Achnasheen 40 miles. There's another large red sign, in fact there's one on either side of the road, which says, road normally impassable in wintry conditions. So if you're travelling around Scotland out of season in the winter months, then firstly I take my hat off to you, and secondly, if you're coming this way, do check road conditions, especially if it's been snowing, because the road called the Applecross Pass may actually be impassable. On the other side of the road is another large red sign which states steep, narrow road unsuitable for caravans. And for my American friends, The caravan is effectively a mobile home towed behind your car. If you are travelling with a caravan, then there's an alternative route via Kenmore and Sheildaig. You may also note in several route maps that the road is not suitable for learner drivers or very large vehicles. It's probably one of the few roads with such a road sign in the world. From this junction, you drive up a narrow single-track road for about 5 miles, which climbs to around 2,000 feet before getting to the Bealach Nabah. Either side of the car is deserted rough scrubland, and you can see why this part of the world is hardly populated. But if you're able to continue along this road, then you are in for a treat. This is the Applecross Pass leading onto the Bealach Nabah, or, as I've mentioned before, the Pass of the Cattle. And the name sort of gives it away because this is a road across the mountains where the cattle would have been driven by the Scottish drovers to get them down to the markets in Falkirk, Edinburgh and London. And there's a link here to America, Canada and probably Australia as well, because the cattle drovers of Scotland, who left their homes and emigrated in the 18th and 19th centuries, went on to become very capable cowherders or cowboys in their new adopted countries. And then, the Pass of the Cattle is just ahead. As I arrive at this road, it reminds me of the tortuous road to the Maneva Pass in the Alps, which has 38 iconic hairpin turns. The Mavina Pass reaches an elevation of 5,500 feet above sea level, so twice the height, but both give you an incredible experience. It might be a little presumptuous of me to compare Bealach Nabah with the Maneva Pass, but you get my drift. Well, the Bealach Nabah was actually built in 1818, but it was not metal surfaced until the 1950s. The biggest problem was finding a contractor who would undertake the work. And there is a story that suggests that the first contractor only lasted 3 months, and that he eventually went insane due to the extreme conditions of the work, with rocks and stones falling on the workforce from above. Working conditions were tough and workmen were paid about $150 a month, and that's around £230 in today's money, or $250, and I'm sure you would not get any workmen to accept £230 per month for 6 days a week and 12 hours a day. However, the landowners also paid for oatmeal for the contractors, as well as blasting materials and a horse and cart, which, if you think about it, was very kind of them. An Edinburgh guidebook published in 1890 described the Bealach Nabah as follows: "Although the road has been engineered by a series of zigzags to ease the gradient as much as possible, nevertheless it is terribly steep and the surface is wretched." So this gives you an idea of what you're letting yourself in for, but believe me, it's worth the drive. You will be descending on hairpin turns from the Cairnglass viewpoint, some 2,000 feet above Loch below, through Corrishalloch between the mountains Maelgorm and Sgurr a Carachan. There are wonderful views all the way down, and don't worry if you're the driver, there are many viewpoints you can stop at on the way down. At the bottom, you'll come to Loch Kishorn, a small inlet around a mile wide and 2 miles long, which is connected to Loch Carron, and beyond that you have the inner sound between the Isle of Skye and the mainland. Just before you turn right onto the main road, the A896, you might want to stop at the Bealach Cafe and Gallery on your left-hand side. At this turning point you will see the brown sign for the NC500 leading to Loch Carron, and also Inverness gets a mention at 71 miles distance. Yes, we're getting closer to our objective. On the right-hand side of the road, keeping us company until we get to the loch, is a sandy inlet and stone shore leading towards a group of settlements which make up Kishorn itself. And these settlements are called Sanachan, Tornapress, Courthill, Achentrade, Ardarach and Runasul. Achentrade has a line of whitewashed cottages which were built originally to house crofters who had been evicted in the Highland clearances. That's another topic I'll be covering in one of my podcasts. The lovely thing about this road is that on a clear day we get a superb view of the mountains we have just descended on passing through the Bealach Nabah. The other thing that may surprise you as you look over the loch is what looks like an industrial area. This is actually the Kishorn fabrication yard for oil platforms and other offshore facilities, with an associated port and dry docking facility. Loch Kishorn is deep at 250 feet, so don't be surprised to see large ships in the dry dock, or perhaps an oil drilling rig nearby awaiting maintenance. In 1992, the dry dock was put to good use for the construction of the bridge footings for the Skye Bridge that now links the Isle of Skye with the mainland. We turn away from Kishorn and head east towards the small village of Loch Carron. The road is still single track in places, but it widens to allow 2 cars to pass, although at the time of this podcast there were no road markings, so drive carefully and be courteous to cars from the opposite direction. 5 miles later, we arrive at the village of Loch Carron. It's aptly named as the village is strung out alongside the Loch Carron. It's a real beauty spot, and the views across the loch to the northern mountains beyond are spectacular. The village stretches out for about 2 miles along the loch and has numerous amenities for the passing tourist, with 2 petrol stations, a post office and a shop, and there's a couple of hotels, a few cafes and a number of B&Bs for those wishing to stay a bit longer. And many do, as Loch Carron is an excellent location for touring and hill walking in the local area. Population about 1,000, and a good friend of mine, a gentleman called Commander Q Banting, moved there when he retired from the Royal Navy. It's a unique and very pleasurable place to stay, and he's enjoyed crofting and sheep rearing as well as other outdoor pursuits. A very lucky man to find his nirvana. If you were to turn off the road and go down the loch in the other direction for about 3 miles, you'd come to the ruin of Strome Castle. To be honest, there's not much left of it but a courtyard and the remains of a square tower, but it's another part of Scotland's history and now under the care of the National Trust for Scotland. The castle was originally built in the 15th century by Alexander MacDonald, Lord of the Isles. In 1539, King James V of Scotland granted the castle to Clan MacDonald of Glengarry, and Clan Munro was constable of the castle for a number of years. In 1602, the castle was besieged by Clan Mackenzie, and after the MacDonalds surrendered, it was blown up and has remained a ruin to this day. I should emphasise that Strome Castle is not on the NC500, but taking the odd detour off the A896 is no bad thing if there's something of interest that you can see. And as we head back up Glen Carron, I'm going to recommend another small detour, and that is turning off the A896 just outside the village and turn right onto the A890, and 5 miles later you come to the wonderful Attadale Gardens, which are well worth a visit. They cover over 20 acres on the south side of Loch Carron itself, across from the village we've just visited, and I have to say it's probably one of the gardens I would not miss. I'm actually going to do a feature on it in a later podcast, so that's all I'll say for now. So, getting back to the junction we took from the A896, we now turn right and continue up the road along Glen Carron. Indeed, the road has now become the A890 and goes all the way to Achnasheen. Glen Carron, remember Glen is a narrow valley, is a very pretty route running alongside the Carron River. On the way there's lochs overlooked by the low-lying hills. Either side of the road are forested areas, both evergreen and deciduous, and this area, with its marshes and small lochs, is a good habitat for wild and wetland flowers. There's marked paths and some parking along the way if you want to venture on a short walk. It takes around 40 minutes to get from Loch Carron to Achnasheen, where you'll find a small village with a couple of cafes and a railway station and a post office, where people buy a postcard to send simply to get the postmark from the Achnasheen post office. It's a tiny settlement of just 28 people, but I'm always surprised how many people have heard of it. Perhaps it's the romantic sounding Scottish name, Achnasheen, but I suppose it has also been an important junction in the centre of the Northern Highlands for hundreds of years. Achnasheen's name comes from the Gairloch for Field of the Storms, which is probably appropriate as it sits at the height of around 500 feet with little shelter of any kind. There's a studio gallery, a cafe, and it's a regular stopping off point for coach tours or Wester Ross. There's also a bunkhouse for walkers and other travellers on a budget. Well, we get back on the road and drive about 6 miles when we come to the tiny village of Achnasheen. I always stop here because there's a brown tourist sign that directs visitors up a steep grassy path to the graveyard at Knocknaban. Here you find the grave of Captain Bertram Dixon, pioneer of military aviation in the years before the First World War. It's a lovely tribute to an aircraft pioneer, and occasionally it's amazing to see modern, fast-jet military aircraft practicing low-level flying down the valley and dipping their wings as they pass this spot. About 10 miles later, we arrive at the crossroads of Garve, now only some 37 miles from Inverness, our final destination. The village of Garve is tiny, but it does have a railway station serving the Kyle of Lochs line, and that's just across from the Isle of Skye. This line crosses the A835 road at a steep angle and is closed when trains are passing by a short barrier at each end of the road. Apparently, this train crossing has seen more near-miss accidents in the past 10 years than any other in the UK, so be careful when approaching this junction and don't try to jump the lights if they turn red. 10 miles later, we get to the small village of Contin, population around 500, and I'm always fascinated by the war memorial on the left-hand side of the road as I pass through. It's a tall tower, built in grey granite and crenellated at the top, a lovely tribute to those who gave their lives for our freedoms. Leaving Contin behind, we continue our journey down the A835 until we get to the junction for the Muir of Ord and the route to Beauly on the A832. When you turn right, you will cross the River Conan by the Moy Bridge, unless that is there's been a lot of rainfall and the bridge is under water. It doesn't happen too often, so you should be fine. You drive on until you come to the Muir of Ord, and just before you enter the village, on the right-hand side you pass the Glen Ord Distillery. You may have been lucky to have tasted the Glen Ord Singleton, but if not, then give it a try. You will, further on, pass a huge building on the right-hand side, and this is the maltings process building making the malted barley. I don't have time to go into the process here, but if you listen to my podcast on whisky, you will understand what it means to malt the barley and how to do it. Muir of Ord is a small town of about 3,000 people. It has reasonably good amenities and is only 9 miles from our final destination. At the end of the road, there's a junction with the A862. To the left is the NC500 North, and to the right is the NC500 South. We're going south, so we turn right and head for Beauly, the last town on our journey. You will pass the Muir of Ord industrial site on the right-hand side, and a couple of miles later you enter the lovely small town of Beauly. And the name comes from the French beau lieu, or beautiful place, and it certainly lives up to its name. Just as you enter the town, on the left-hand side is St Mary's Catholic Church, which was built around 1864. A few hundred yards later, and you arrive into the main street. The first building on the left-hand side is the now ruined Beauly Priory, which was a Valliscolian monastic community founded around 1230 by Alexander II of Scotland. The ruins are well worth a visit, and some of the headstones have very interesting stories attached to them, such as Hugh Fraser, 3rd Lord Lovat, who was buried here after he was killed at the Battle of the Shirts in 1544. I'll cover the main battles of Scotland in a future podcast, and believe me, there were plenty of them. I'm not going to say much more about the town, as it was covered sufficiently in my podcasts on Inverness to Gairloch, so we continue on the A862 towards Inverness. And it's a straight run into the capital of the Highlands, with the Beauly Firth on our left-hand side. The first sight of the towers of the Kessock Bridge, connecting Inverness with the Black Isle, is the first indication of our proximity to the city. We've passed this way before, and you may recall in my other podcasts, the Buncrew House Hotel, that I normally stop at for some refreshment when I'm touring the north. It's an easy run into the centre of Inverness, and you'll be on the A82 as you turn left onto Ness Walk, and then you're crossing the River Ness, and above you, up on the right-hand side, is the iconic Inverness Castle. Cross the bridge, follow the road up to the right, and you find yourself in the car park of the castle itself, overlooked by Flora MacDonald, that heroine who saved Bonnie Prince Charlie. And that, my friends, is you home, having completed the North Coast 500. Jump out of the car and give everyone a huge hug. Huge congratulations. What an epic journey, and what amazing sights we've seen. And that, as they say, is a wrap. We've come to the end of my North Coast 500 series of podcasts, and I can only thank you for joining me on this amazing adventure. It has been a wonderful trip for me, remembering all those fabulous places that I've visited, and I do hope that you've enjoyed it too. You can go to my website to see some photographs associated with this podcast, which should enhance the experience. And if this is the first one you've listened to, then go back and start at the first episode and work your way through. I'm delighted to let you know that I'm going to rerun my Eventbrite virtual video tours, so look out for them on my Facebook page, and there will be a connection to virtual tours on the front of my website in the coming months. There are already some videos up on my YouTube channel, and you can find them by searching Exclusive Scottish Visits, and there will be a lot more content in the coming months. Well, I do hope that you've enjoyed this latest Unique Scotland podcast as much as I have enjoyed bringing it to you. Any comments are most welcome, and drop me a line using the contact page of my website, exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk, or email me directly using john@exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk. I always like to hear how and where you listen to the podcast, so do let me know. And please don't forget to subscribe on the podcast page of the website to receive notifications of future Unique Scotland podcasts. My next episode will be the relaunch of my Letter from Scotland series, to be published initially every 3 months, starting next month. My next touring podcast will be the first episode of a 3-part series on Edinburgh City, and I can't wait to share that with you in February. Well, I've thoroughly enjoyed having you with me on this final part of my tour around the North Coast 500. It's been an amazing journey from Inverness all the way to the top of Scotland, down the west coast and back to Inverness. And if you do plan to do it in person at some point in the future, then please let me know. Of course, you can always book a tour with me personally and we could complete it together. That would be fun. So anyway, congratulations again for completing this epic journey with me, and now, to you, I send my very best wishes, and wherever you are in the world, I raise a glass of whisky in the traditional Scottish fashion, Slàinte.
You've been listening to the Unique Scotland podcast with exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk. To receive all our episodes automatically, please subscribe now.